Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic age. Chapter 1. Origins of a Mind. The spark in the city of light. Robert Oppenheimer was born into brilliance, though no one could have predicted just how much light or darkness his life would unleash into the world. Born on the 22nd of April, 1904, in New York City, Julius Robert Oppenheimer entered a world of privilege and possibility. His father, Julius Oppenheimer, was a wealthy German-Jewish immigrant who had arrived in America in 1888, with no money and no English, but with an ambition that would build a textile importing fortune. His mother, Ella Friedman, was a cultured, refined woman, a painter by passion, who taught young Robert the value of art and intellect in equal measure. The Oppenheimers lived in a luxurious apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, overlooking the Hudson River. Their home was filled with paintings by Cézanne, books in multiple languages, and antique furniture. The environment was elegant, but not ostentatious. Intellectual stimulation reigned over materialism. In the young Robert's eyes, the world was a puzzle, and he intended to solve it. An extraordinary child in an ordinary world. From the beginning, Robert was different, not only precocious, but almost alien in his intensity. By the age of 4, he was reading complex books. By 5, he had already developed a fascination with minerals, which would evolve into a childhood hobby of collecting rocks and classifying them with scientific precision. He corresponded with local geological societies at the age of 10. Robert's mind worked faster than his words. Teachers noted he often paused in the middle of sentences as though his thoughts had outrun his ability to express them. He had trouble playing with other children. Social awkwardness, a recurring theme throughout his life, was evident from these early years. Even in childhood, he was more comfortable with ideas than with people. His younger brother, Frank Oppenheimer, born in 1912, would later also become a physicist, but even he noted how distant and intense Robert was, even in youth. Friends were few, solitude was frequent, ethical culture, and the moral compass. Oppenheimer attended the Ethical Culture School, a private institution in New York founded on the humanist ideals of Felix Adler. The school emphasized not just academic excellence, but also ethical behavior, civic responsibility, and global thinking. It was here that Robert first encountered a structured yet progressive form of education that matched his intellect. The curriculum was demanding, but creative literature, classical languages, mathematics, sciences, and philosophy were all studied with depth. Robert thrived. He devoured texts. He memorized poetry. He studied French and Latin. He once described the experience at Ethical Culture as being intellectually and morally intense. The school instilled in him a lifelong sense of ethical responsibility. Though he would later help unleash the most powerful weapon in human history, the seeds of his moral turmoil were planted during these formative years. The idea that science must serve humanity, taught to him in classrooms filled with sunlight and Socratic inquiry, never left him. It would later become the very cause of his downfall. Solitude and the power of books. Outside the classroom, Robert was happiest alone. He did not attend parties, rarely joined games, and was prone to isolation. His parents worried about his social detachment, but they also saw his brilliance and did not wish to restrain it. Instead of friends, he turned to books. He read Plato, Dante, Shakespeare, and the Bhagavad Gita before most children had graduated from picture books. He learned Greek, French, and German fluently. Later, he would study Sanskrit to read ancient Hindu texts in their original language. The Gita, in particular, would become a lifelong spiritual anchor for him, especially during the darkest moral storms. He was fascinated by the duality of the world, beauty and destruction, intellect and emotion, science and ethics. These dualities would haunt him throughout his adult life and shape the inner conflicts that would define his legacy. The turning point. illness and epiphany. At the age of 11, Oppenheimer contracted dysentery and was bedridden for weeks. During this time, he immersed himself in science books, especially on chemistry and mineralogy. It was here that his interest in natural sciences took a firm root. Later, during adolescence, he joined the New York Mineralogical Club, where he gave a lecture on a rare mineral, despite being years younger than all the other members. The club, believing they were dealing with an adult, were stunned to meet a thin, nervous teenager. He also began writing poetry, essays, and philosophical reflections. One early letter to a cousin read, "It is occasionally true that a child of 10 may possess a better grasp of truth than a man of 50. Emotional undercurrents and loneliness." Despite his achievements, Robert struggled with emotional regulation. He suffered from sudden mood swings, and even in adolescence was prone to depression and introspective despair. His diaries reveal a young man who felt out of place in the world. He often viewed himself through a critical lens, both overconfident and self-loathing. There is some evidence, drawn from family correspondence, that Robert may have exhibited signs of obsessive-compulsive tendencies and possibly mild neuroses. Though never formally diagnosed, many biographers describe his psychological complexity as intrinsic to both his genius and later ethical collapse. The foundations of a split identity. By the time Robert entered adulthood, he was already becoming a man of contradictions. Scientist and philosopher, patriot and skeptic, charismatic yet solitary, coldly rational yet deeply poetic. These contradictions would later manifest in critical decisions, emotional meltdowns, and self-imposed exile. But in these early days, they simply made him a boy too old for his age, too serious for his peers, and too burdened for his own comfort. Looking forward, as he approached college age, the world was already watching the aftermath of World War I, the collapse of empires, and the dawning of modern science. Into this world would step Robert Oppenheimer, ready to challenge atoms, unravel the universe, and unknowingly prepare for a moral reckoning unlike any faced by scientists before or since. Chapter 2. A Scholar's Path, Education and Academic Growth. From New York to Cambridge, a new world of science. In 1922, at the age of 18, Robert Oppenheimer enrolled at Harvard University. Although Harvard was a bastion of classical education, Oppenheimer saw it as a gateway to infinite possibilities. He pursued a rigorous course of study with an unusual breadth: chemistry, physics, mathematics, French literature, philosophy, and Eastern religion. What set him apart was not just intelligence, but range. Within 3 years, he completed his bachelor's degree summa cum laude, having taken more courses than required and excelling in nearly all. His professors described him as singularly brilliant, but emotionally elusive. Harvard, for Oppenheimer, was not merely a university, it was a battlefield of ideas. He thrived in solitude, read obsessively, and even wrote poetry on the side. The fusion of art and science in his mind had already begun to crystallize. But physics, particularly theoretical physics, called to him more powerfully than anything else. This was the era when quantum theory was emerging, challenging the Newtonian order of the universe. Oppenheimer knew he had to stand at the epicenter of this revolution. The Cavendish Laboratory, a jolt of reality. In 1925, Robert Oppenheimer traveled to England to pursue postgraduate studies at the University of Cambridge, where he was accepted into the famed Cavendish Laboratory under J.J. Thomson, later shifting under the supervision of Patrick Blackett. The Cavendish was a world leader in experimental physics, but Oppenheimer's strengths were theoretical. He was not suited to the clumsy, hands-on labor of the lab bench. He struggled physically and emotionally. He accidentally poisoned his supervisor's apple with chemicals out of frustration, an act that may have been more symbolic than lethal. Nevertheless, it revealed a troubled emotional state. He suffered nervous breakdowns, was diagnosed with psychological instability, and at one point sought psychoanalysis. Friends began to worry about his mental health. Despite these personal difficulties, he began to publish papers on quantum theory. He soon realized that his true intellectual destiny lay not in Cambridge's laboratories, but in Germany, where quantum mechanics was being born. Göttingen, where genius found its echo. In 1926, Oppenheimer moved to Göttingen, Germany, to study under Max Born, a leading figure in quantum mechanics. Göttingen was a haven for theoretical physics, and Oppenheimer was surrounded by the likes of Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, and Enrico Fermi. It was here that Robert came alive. He was publishing extensively, debating ideas passionately, and engaging in the core development of quantum wave function mechanics. Between 1926 and 1929, he authored more than a dozen scientific papers, including work on the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, a key contribution to molecular quantum mechanics. His social skills improved slightly in Germany. He even took part in spirited gatherings, hiked, and discussed literature with his colleagues. Yet his solitude remained intact. Though intellectually engaged, he often avoided emotional closeness. In 1927, Oppenheimer earned his Ph.D. at the age of 23. The dissertation and body of work he had produced marked him as a rising star in theoretical physics. Unlike many American physicists of the era, Oppenheimer had trained at the very heart of European physics, and this would set him apart for the rest of his career. Returned to America, a new kind of professor. Upon returning to the United States in 1929, Oppenheimer received dual offers from the University of California, Berkeley, and California Institute of Technology, Caltech. He accepted both, splitting his time between the two. His reputation had already preceded him, and his lectures became legendary. He spoke with passion, clarity, and metaphor. He would quote Baudelaire or the Bhagavad Gita while explaining quantum field theory. His charisma in the lecture hall masked his private insecurities. Students found him magnetic, though sometimes intimidating. He often paced while speaking, gesturing dramatically as if performing intellectual theater. His courses covered not only quantum mechanics, but also special relativity, general relativity, electrodynamics, and nuclear physics subjects that would later form the scientific basis for the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer was no longer a solitary genius. He was becoming a shaper of generations. The duality deepens, spiritual and political thought. During this academic period, Oppenheimer also expanded his interests in philosophy and religion. He studied Hinduism in depth and began learning Sanskrit so he could read the Bhagavad Gita in its original form. This text would later influence his reflections on the atomic bomb, particularly its verses on cosmic duty and destruction. Politically, he became increasingly engaged with leftist ideologies. The 1932nd were the age of the Great Depression, fascist rise in Europe, and worker movements in America. He began supporting anti-fascist causes, donated to the Spanish Civil War Republican side, and attended Marxist lectures. Although never officially a member of the Communist Party, he hosted meetings at his home and formed intimate relationships with communist sympathizers. These affiliations would later come back to haunt him during the Red Scare. Scientific achievements before the bomb. Before the war, Oppenheimer made crucial contributions to cosmic ray theory, positron theory, and quantum electrodynamics. He worked on problems involving gravitational collapse, predicting phenomena that would later be known as black holes, though the term did not exist then. He also collaborated with George Volkoff and Hartland Snyder on papers that addressed neutron stars and relativistic stellar models. These were groundbreaking efforts that helped lay the groundwork for modern astrophysics. Yet even as he achieved prominence in his field, he remained something of an outsider. neither fully embraced by the European tradition nor fully rooted in American pragmatism. He was too poetic for some physicists, too abstract for others, and too aloof to be easily categorized. The professor, as icon, by the late 1932nd, Oppenheimer was known not just for his papers, but for his presence. Students from across the country sought to study under him. His lectures were transfixing, and his mentorship was both rigorous and inspiring. Among his students were future Nobel laureates who would later join him at Los Alamos. He dressed impeccably tailored suits, polished shoes, chain-smoking Chesterfields, and often with a distant philosophical gaze. He seemed like a man out of time, or perhaps ahead of it. People described him as mercurial, magnetic, and maddening. Yet behind this aura was a deep loneliness. His romantic life was complicated. He formed intense relationships, often with brilliant women, but struggled with intimacy and commitment. His passion was tempered by existential dread, and his heart seemed always half-closed. The gathering storm, physics meets politics. As World War II approached, science and politics collided in ways that would forever change Oppenheimer's life. In 1939, Einstein and Leo Szilard warned President Roosevelt of Nazi attempts to build an atomic weapon. The United States responded by launching secret research, and physicists were soon enlisted for military service. In 1941, Oppenheimer was recruited for the early phases of atomic research. Despite his previous political associations, the government deemed his intellect indispensable. By 1942, he would be appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project, a role that would make him both immortal and morally tormented. Chapter 3: The Teacher and the Thinker, Berkeley and Caltech Years. A Dual Appointment. The West Coast Scientific Oracle. After his return to the United States in 1929, Robert Oppenheimer embarked on what would become one of the most influential academic careers in American science. He was offered joint appointments at University of California, Berkeley, and the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. This unusual arrangement allowed him to teach and research at two of the most prestigious institutions on the West Coast, an acknowledgment of his growing reputation as a theoretical physicist of rare brilliance. At Berkeley, he quickly became a force of intellectual gravity. His lectures were electrifying, filled with a unique blend of rigorous physics and poetic expression. He paced the classroom like a theatrical performer, writing long equations on the blackboard while interjecting quotes from Baudelaire, Shakespeare, or the Bhagavad Gita. Students would lean forward in silence, hanging on every word, often unsure whether they were in a physics seminar or a philosophical salon. At Caltech, his focus was more research-oriented. There, he collaborated with experimentalists, worked on publications in quantum electrodynamics, and mentored some of the brightest postdocs of the era. His presence at both institutions helped elevate American theoretical physics to the global stage. Previously, the U.S. had lagged behind Europe in high-level theoretical research. An intellectual magnet, Oppenheimer's charisma extended far beyond physics. He was often described as a man whose mind sparkled like champagne. Students, colleagues, and even passers-by were drawn to his piercing blue eyes, clipped voice, and sharp wit. He could talk as fluently about Proust as about Planck's constant, and was equally comfortable discussing relativity theory or Rilke's poetry. But this intellectual magnetism was double-edged. He could be cutting, dismissive, and egotistical. Some students adored him, others feared him. Many colleagues found him brilliant, but emotionally erratic. One student said, "He could make you feel like the dumbest person alive with just a raised eyebrow." Still, many stayed. They accepted the emotional roller coaster because the intellectual journey was like no other. Oppenheimer was more than a teacher. He was a catalyst, a man who opened doors in the minds of others and then dared them to walk through. A new kind of physicist. Unlike many physicists of the time, Oppenheimer was not merely interested in solving problems he sought meaning. He believed that the universe was not just a mechanical clockwork, but a canvas of hidden truths. Physics, for him, was a form of mysticism with equations. He often said that understanding the cosmos was like reading the mind of God. His lectures reflected this. He would speak of wave-particle duality in the same breath as philosophical dualism, linking the uncertainty principle with human choice and existential angst. For many students, it was intoxicating. For others, confusing. But no one forgot it. He wrote extensively during this period on quantum field theory, positron behavior, cosmic ray showers, and relativistic stars, papers that would become foundational in their respective fields. He was not just interpreting the new physics, he was helping create it. His students, a generation forged. Among his students were future legends of physics, including Melba Phillips, one of the few prominent women in physics at the time, Robert Serber, who would later help him at Los Alamos, Hans Bethe, whom he would later clash and collaborate with on the bomb project, Luis Alvarez and Isidore Rabi, both Nobel Prize winners. Oppenheimer was known for encouraging originality. He wanted his students not just to understand physics, but to challenge it. He gave them impossible problems, hoping their failure would produce novel solutions. He was exacting, demanding, and frequently cruel in feedback, but he produced a generation of innovators, an increasingly complex private life. While his professional life soared, Oppenheimer's personal life grew murky. He had a series of romantic relationships, often intense, frequently tumultuous. He fell deeply in love with Jean Tatlock, a psychiatrist and member of the Communist Party USA, whose passion for politics and poetry matched his own. Their relationship was stormy, passionate, intellectual, but emotionally volatile. Tatlock suffered from depression, and their affair was marked by long absences, desperate letters, and mutual withdrawal. Despite their connection, Oppenheimer ultimately married another woman, but Jean would remain a lingering shadow in his emotional life. Her later suicide would devastate him. In 1940, he married Catherine, Kitty Poenning, a biologist and former communist. Together, they had 2 children, Peter and Tony, but their marriage was troubled from the beginning. Kitty was sharp, educated, and politically active, but also emotionally unstable and alcoholic. Their home life was described by friends as beautifully educated chaos, leftist sympathies, and dangerous liaisons. During the Great Depression, Oppenheimer became increasingly politically active. He donated to labor unions, anti-fascist organizations, and Spanish Civil War refugees. His circle included professors, poets, and radicals. He read Marx, Trotsky, and even hosted meetings with members of the Communist Party in his home. He never officially joined the party, but his associations were deep enough to raise suspicion. The FBI opened a file on him, and federal agents would later shadow him during his Manhattan Project years. Yet to Oppenheimer, politics was not ideology, it was morality. He believed in social justice, in the need for intellectuals to engage with suffering, and in the duty of science to serve humanity. He was more humanist than communist, more idealist than radical, but the political winds of the 1942nd would not allow such nuance. A rising star with a hidden storm. By the early 1942nd, Oppenheimer was at his professional zenith. He was a leading voice in American physics, a revered teacher, and a cultural figure of sorts. He hosted salons at his home, debated art and politics over wine, and hiked the hills of Berkeley in quiet solitude. But beneath the charm, brilliance, and acclaim was a man increasingly divided between science and ethics, between romanticism and reason, between public service and private guilt. He was building theories of atomic structure by day and staring into existential abysses by night. He would later write, In science, there are truths. In life, there are consequences. He did not yet know how dire those consequences would be. Prelude to destiny, the government calls. As tensions mounted globally and war became inevitable, the U.S. government began seeking scientific minds to work on atomic research. Oppenheimer was a natural candidate, brilliant, charismatic, and well-networked, but his political history posed a risk. Still, General Leslie Groves, the hard-nosed military man assigned to lead the top-secret Manhattan Project, saw in Oppenheimer the spark of genius necessary to make the bomb real. Despite resistance, Groves vouched for him personally. In 1942, Robert Oppenheimer was named scientific director of the Manhattan Project. It was a role that would test every fiber of his intellect, leadership, and morality. The teacher would become a general, the thinker, a builder of worlds. Chapter 4: Personal Tensions, Love, Politics, and Internal Divides. The Inner Battleground. By the early 1942nd, Robert Oppenheimer was a man of growing paradoxes. Outwardly, he was charismatic, respected, and intellectually dominant, yet internally, he wrestled with deep insecurities, emotional turbulence, and a mounting sense of existential dread. His romantic entanglements, political sympathies, and spiritual reflections began to converge in a tangle of contradictions that would define both his leadership and his legacy. Unlike many of his scientific peers, Oppenheimer lived not merely in the world of facts, but also in the realm of emotion, mystery, and doubt. Jean Tatlock, the ghost that would not fade. Jean Tatlock, the daughter of a Stanford professor and a passionate member of the Communist Party USA, was unlike any woman Oppenheimer had ever met. Intelligent, poetic, and melancholic, she stirred both his heart and his mind. Their relationship began in 1936 and quickly became intense. Jean introduced him to Marxist ideas, and their long walks often included discussions about psychoanalysis, literature, human suffering, and the fight against fascism. Oppenheimer was captivated not just by her intellect, but by her tragic beauty and passionate worldview. Yet, Jean's struggles with clinical depression and Oppenheimer's emotional unavailability created an unstable bond. He would retreat, she would withdraw. Their love was never resolved, and when he married Kitty Pointing, their romantic relationship ended, but their emotional connection did not. Even while working on the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer made secret visits to Jean in San Francisco. These were risky not only emotionally, but politically, given her communist affiliations and the top-secret nature of his work. In 1944, shortly after one such visit, Jean was found dead in her bathtub. The official cause was suicide. Oppenheimer was devastated. He rarely spoke of her again, but her memory haunted him. Later, when questioned about their relationship during a security hearing, he grew visibly shaken. Jean Tatlock was the one woman he had truly loved and lost. Kitty Oppenheimer, a complicated union. Kitty Pointing, a German, American, and former Communist Party member, was Oppenheimer's wife in name and in public appearance, but their marriage was fraught with dysfunction. Kitty was sharp, politically engaged, and educated in biology, but she was also emotionally volatile, prone to alcoholism, and distant as a mother. The couple's early years were marred by jealousy, infidelity, and Kitty's disdain for Oppenheimer's passivity at home. She resented his emotional aloofness, and he recoiled from her instability. Yet they remained together, bound perhaps by mutual need and shared political values rather than love. Their two children, Peter and Tony, were raised in a household often filled with intellectuals, alcohol, arguments, and long silences. Friends described the Oppenheimer home as intellectually intense, emotionally fractured, a man of contradictory loyalties. As war loomed and the Manhattan Project gained urgency, Oppenheimer's past political affiliations placed him under FBI surveillance. He had donated to anti-fascist causes, fraternized with communists, and was closely tied to individuals who were party members. Though never a confirmed party member himself, his associations were deep, varied, and troubling to the government. Oppenheimer, however, was motivated not by Marxist dogma but by moral urgency. He viewed fascism as a global threat and believed science had to serve the public good. Yet, in a bitter irony, the same convictions that led him to oppose tyranny also led him to build the deadliest weapon in human history. His friends were divided. Some believed he had sold out, others that he had risen to serve a higher purpose. Oppenheimer himself was tormented. He once said, in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, have felt it deeply, the Bhagavad Gita and moral reflection. During this period, Oppenheimer's spiritual life grew increasingly significant. He was deeply influenced by Hindu texts, particularly the Bhagavad Gita, which he read in Sanskrit. One passage would become inseparable from his legacy. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He quoted this line when recalling the first detonation of an atomic bomb. But to him, it was not a triumphal boast, it was a lamentation. The Gita, with its focus on duty without attachment, helped him rationalize his role in the project. Like the warrior Arjuna, he believed he was carrying out cosmic duty, but he knew it came at a moral price. The Gita allowed him to live with the contradiction that to save humanity from fascism, he had to help unleash destruction on an unimaginable scale. An outsider among insiders. Despite his role in America's greatest military scientific undertaking, Oppenheimer was never fully trusted by the military or the FBI. General Leslie Groves, who admired Oppenheimer's intellect, nonetheless viewed him as politically dangerous. He had security clearance, but only because Groves personally intervened. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover never stopped doubting him and continued collecting surveillance material on him for years. Oppenheimer was an alien figure among the rigid bureaucrats and military men. He wore elegant suits, quoted ancient texts, spoke with an airy detachment, and moved like a philosopher in a room full of soldiers. He was needed but never fully accepted. Leadership amid suspicion. As scientific director of the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer had to unify a vast network of physicists, chemists, engineers, and military personnel. The task required diplomacy, vision, and relentless energy. And he delivered. Despite his emotional baggage, he proved to be an extraordinary leader. He earned the respect of top scientists like Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, and Niels Bohr, not through authority, but through inspiration. He knew when to encourage, when to challenge, and when to withdraw. But even as he organized breakthroughs in bomb design, he continued to struggle privately. He often suffered migraines, fatigue, and emotional burnout. He smoked incessantly, drank copiously, and rarely slept well. At times he wandered the New Mexico desert alone, watching the horizon with a gaze that others described as haunted. Moral isolation. As the bomb neared completion, some of Oppenheimer's colleagues began to have ethical doubts. Leo Szilard and James Frank circulated petitions arguing that the bomb should be demonstrated, not used on civilians. Oppenheimer, however, argued for military use, believing it would shorten the war and save lives. It was a pragmatic decision, but one he would regret. He was alone, caught between scientists pleading for conscience and generals demanding action. The president would never consult the scientists. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be bombed. The world would change forever. Oppenheimer's moment of triumph was also his moment of irreversible sorrow. The cracks begin to show. By the end of 1945, after Japan's surrender, Oppenheimer returned to civilian life, a national hero, yet he was emotionally shattered. He had helped win the war, but felt he had lost something of his soul. His political enemies sensed this vulnerability and prepared to strike. The FBI intensified its investigations. Congress began probing the political leanings of scientists. In the Cold War atmosphere, loyalty became a weapon. Oppenheimer would soon find himself betrayed by colleagues, humiliated by the government he had served, and exiled from the very scientific community he helped elevate. The divided man. Oppenheimer's dual identity as creator and critic, builder and doubter, scientist and poet would come to define his post-war life. He was no longer just a physicist. He had become a symbol of the moral ambiguity of science. Friends worried about him. He became thinner, more withdrawn. His lectures turned darker, often laced with veiled regrets. He read Greek tragedies, spoke of Faust, and quoted Kierkegaard. When asked if he regretted building the bomb, he answered with a pause and said, "In a way, I wish we hadn't done it, but I also know there was no choice." Conclusion. The cracks before the collapse. In these years, Oppenheimer was both at his most powerful and most fragile. He had helped end a war but awakened an arms race. He had become a public figure but lost his private sanctuary. He was haunted by Jean, estranged from Kitty, and estranged from himself. And as the Cold War began, so too did the Second War of Robert Oppenheimer's life, the one not fought in the deserts of New Mexico, but in the halls of government, in courtrooms, and within the chambers of his conscience. Chapter 5. The Manhattan Project, Birth of the Atomic Age. A secret war begins. In 1942, with World War II engulfing the globe and rumors that Nazi Germany was pursuing nuclear weapons, the U.S. government launched one of the most ambitious scientific and military efforts in history, the Manhattan Project. Its goal, to build an atomic bomb before the enemy. Robert Oppenheimer, despite his controversial political associations, was chosen as the scientific director of the project. It was a risky appointment. He had no administrative experience, and some in the government doubted his loyalty. But General Leslie Groves, the project's military commander, saw in him an intellectual brilliance and an ability to inspire others, qualities desperately needed for success. With that appointment, Oppenheimer's life would change forever. So would the world. Choosing Los Alamos. Groves and Oppenheimer quickly agreed that the bomb's development needed to occur in isolation, away from spies, distractions, and even the prying eyes of scientists not directly involved. Oppenheimer, who loved the American Southwest, suggested a remote mesa in northern New Mexico near Santa Fe. The location was known as Los Alamos. Once home to a boys' ranch school, the site was converted into a high-security laboratory complex almost overnight. Barracks, labs, and bunkers rose from the dust. Scientists were relocated with their families, often without being told what they were working on. They simply knew it was important to the war. To Oppenheimer, Los Alamos was more than a secret laboratory. It was a crucible of history. He threw himself into the work with obsessive intensity, often working 18-hour days, skipping meals, and chain smoking, bringing the best minds together. At Los Alamos, Oppenheimer assembled the greatest concentration of scientific minds the world had ever seen. His leadership attracted a constellation of stars. Enrico Fermi, the architect of the first nuclear reactor. Richard Feynman, the young genius with unorthodox flair. Niels Bohr, the Danish legend of quantum theory. Hans Bethe, whom Oppenheimer appointed to head the theoretical division. Edward Teller, a brilliant and difficult man obsessed with the hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer managed them all not through orders, but through charisma, conversation, and challenge. He hosted evening seminars, debated philosophy over cocktails, and walked with scientists in the pine forests to untangle theoretical knots. He became the conductor of a symphonic machine of science, pushing everyone toward a singular, deadly goal. The technical challenges. The scientific problems were daunting. Two different paths were pursued to develop fission bombs: uranium-235, which required separating the rare isotope from natural uranium, an expensive, laborious process; plutonium-239, a synthetic element produced in nuclear reactors. Oppenheimer's team focused on plutonium, which required a complex implosion design, a sphere of conventional explosives compressing the plutonium core into a supercritical state. It was risky, untested, and terrifying. If it failed, years of work and billions of dollars would be wasted. Oppenheimer worked alongside his colleagues, diving into equations, questioning assumptions, demanding better results. Despite his own limited hands-on lab experience, he was able to synthesize ideas across fields, connecting chemistry with physics, engineering with theory, the human side of the lab. Though the mission was secret, life at Los Alamos had its rhythms. Scientists brought families, attended dances, hiked the surrounding mountains, and built a temporary civilization among the sagebrush and canyons. Children rode bikes past bomb components. Wives gossiped about chain reactions over tea. Still, the pressure was immense. Deadlines loomed. Mistakes could be fatal. Accidents occurred, one resulting in the radiation death of physicist Harry Daghlian. Another, involving Louis Slotin, became infamous for its horrifying description: a blue flash and then a slow death. Through it all, Oppenheimer remained the center of the operation, dashing, brilliant, burdened. He carried secrets he could not share, even with his wife. Security woes and FBI scrutiny. Despite Grove's support, Oppenheimer remained under suspicion. The FBI tapped his phones, opened his mail, and questioned his loyalty. His brother Frank and wife Kitty had both been communists. His former lover, Jean Tatlock, remained a sensitive subject, especially given his clandestine visit to her in 1943. The Army created a file labeled Robert Oppenheimer, Security Risk. Groves overruled the objections, insisting that Oppenheimer was indispensable, but the shadow of doubt lingered, and it would one day return to destroy him. The Trinity Test, Fire from the Sky. After 3 years of fevered work, setbacks, and breakthroughs, the bomb was ready for testing. The chosen site was a desert basin in Alamogordo, New Mexico, known as the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man. At 5:29 a.m. on the 16th of July, 1945, the first atomic bomb in history, codenamed Trinity, was detonated. A searing light brighter than the sun filled the sky. The ground shook. A mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the air. The world had entered a new era. Oppenheimer, standing among his colleagues, whispered lines from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Those who witnessed the blast were awestruck, some cheering, others weeping. One scientist said, "We knew the world would never be the same." The target debates. With the bomb now real, the question arose: where and how should it be used? Oppenheimer joined a military advisory panel to determine targets. The options were chilling: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto, Kokura. Oppenheimer argued that the bomb should be used to end the war quickly, but he expressed concern over targeting cultural sites like Kyoto. He supported the bombing of Hiroshima. When the attack was carried out on the 6th of August, 1945, it killed more than 100,000 people. 3 days later, Nagasaki was bombed, with similar devastation. Japan surrendered shortly after. The war was over. But for Oppenheimer, the emotional toll was just beginning. Victory or catastrophe? Initially, Oppenheimer was hailed as a hero. Time and Life magazines called him the father of the atomic bomb. Scientists celebrated, military leaders saluted. The press portrayed him as a modern Prometheus, bringing fire to humanity. But Oppenheimer did not bask in glory. Instead, he became increasingly withdrawn, haunted by the scale of destruction. He said, "In delivering the bomb, we have delivered ourselves into a world of fear." He met with President Truman in October 1945 and told him, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman was infuriated. He later called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist and told aides never to let him in the Oval Office again. Shifting morality. After the war, Oppenheimer turned against further development of nuclear weapons. He opposed the hydrogen bomb, which was far more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. His stance put him at odds with Edward Teller, who championed the H-bomb project. To Oppenheimer, the arms race was a moral catastrophe in the making. He began advocating for international control of atomic energy, transparency, and diplomacy. His transformation from bomb maker to peace advocate unsettled many in government and enraged hawks in the military-industrial complex. He had become a liability. Conclusion: the world forever changed. The Manhattan Project was a triumph of science, engineering, and wartime logistics, but it was also the birth of nuclear fear. Oppenheimer had fulfilled the government's goal, but in doing so, he unleashed something irreversible. His own words said it best. "We knew the world would not be the same." He had helped end one war, but in doing so had helped ignite the Cold War. And now, the very nation that had entrusted him with its greatest secret would begin to dismantle his reputation, strip his security, and question his loyalty. Chapter 6. The Fall. Security Hearings and Public Humiliation. From hero to suspect. The years following World War II were a paradox for Robert Oppenheimer. In the public's imagination, he was a scientific celebrity, revered for leading the creation of the atomic bomb that ended the war. Yet in private, in the corridors of Washington and inside the Pentagon, he was increasingly viewed as a security risk and even a threat. By 1947, Oppenheimer had become chairman of the General Advisory Committee, GAC, of the newly established U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC. It was a position of prestige, but also one that required navigating the emerging landscape of Cold War paranoia, Soviet espionage, and nuclear escalation. His stance on limiting nuclear weapons development, and especially his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, H-bomb, alienated him from powerful figures in the defense and political establishment. One of his most vociferous opponents was Edward Teller, a former colleague at Los Alamos, who had once admired Oppenheimer but now saw him as an obstacle. The turning tide. The tide turned definitively in 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. American intelligence was stunned. How had the Soviets caught up so quickly? The answer: espionage. Scientists like Klaus Fuchs, who had worked under Oppenheimer at Los Alamos, had secretly passed key information to the Soviets. Even though Oppenheimer had no involvement, the incident reignited suspicions about his communist connections from the 1,932nd and 42nd. More damaging still, his opposition to the H-bomb was now interpreted by some as evidence of disloyalty or even sympathy toward the Soviets. Behind the scenes, a campaign to bring him down began, quietly orchestrated by Louis Strauss, chairman of the AEC, and supported by others in the military-industrial complex. The loyalty file reopens. Oppenheimer had long been under scrutiny by the FBI and the Army. His security file was extensive, with references to his past involvement with leftist organizations, his affair with Jean Tatlock, a Communist Party member, his reluctance to name names during security debriefings, his contradictory accounts about meetings with communist friends. In 1953, he was summoned to testify, not yet under accusation, but clearly under suspicion. He was asked to explain again his past political associations, his stance on the hydrogen bomb, and his relationships with people deemed subversive. He cooperated, but inconsistently. He minimized or forgot details. He hedged. He protected old friends. All of this only made investigators more suspicious. The security clearance revoked on the 21st of December, 1953, Oppenheimer received a letter from the AEC informing him that his security clearance was suspended. He was accused of associating with communists, opposing the H-bomb for political rather than scientific reasons, lying to investigators during security interviews. He requested a hearing. What followed was one of the most public humiliations ever inflicted on an American scientist. The security hearing, a national spectacle. In April 1954, a closed-door security hearing began in Washington, D.C. Though not technically a criminal trial, the proceeding bore all the marks of a political purge. Oppenheimer was subjected to harsh cross-examinations, repetitive questioning about 2 zero-year-old communist ties, personal attacks on his honesty, judgment, and patriotism. Witnesses were called. Some defended him, like Hans Bethe, who praised his integrity. But the most damaging testimony came from Edward Teller, who said, "I would feel more secure if public matters would rest in other hands." The betrayal was devastating. Oppenheimer, humiliated and emotionally exhausted, sat silently as former friends questioned his loyalty and judgment. A tragic verdict. On the 29th of June, 1954, the AEC ruled that Robert Oppenheimer was a security risk and would not have his clearance reinstated. He was not tried for espionage. He was not charged with a crime, yet his reputation was shattered. A man once called the most brilliant mind of his generation was now barred from advising the government on the very science he helped create. The symbolism was unmistakable. The father of the atomic bomb had become its political casualty. The fallout. The decision shocked the scientific community. Physicists across America and Europe voiced outrage. Nobel laureates signed petitions. Editorials in the New York Times and the Washington Post condemned the verdict. But the damage was done. Oppenheimer became a symbol of McCarthy-era paranoia, a tragic figure caught between science, politics, and morality. He returned to Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, where he continued to write, lecture, and reflect, but the fire was gone. He had been broken not by nuclear fission, but by betrayal and suspicion. The personal toll, the emotional toll of the hearing was profound. Oppenheimer became increasingly withdrawn and melancholic. His relationship with his wife Kitty, already strained by years of neglect, infidelity, and alcoholism, deteriorated further. He spent long hours alone, walking the woods or reading poetry. He rarely spoke of the trial. He never publicly attacked his accusers. Privately, however, he confided his anguish to friends. One described him as a haunted man, forever replaying decisions he could not undo. He had once said, "In the morning I wake up and think, what have I done?" Now, the question echoed louder than ever. His complex personality laid bare. The security hearing revealed the contradictions that defined Oppenheimer. He was brilliant, but not always truthful. He was patriotic, but had sympathized with radicals. He was devoted to science, but entangled in philosophy and literature. He was a leader, yet ultimately powerless to save himself. He longed to be both scientist and sage, both public hero and private poet. But in Cold War America, such complexity was dangerous. The state demanded loyalty, clarity, and simplicity, traits Oppenheimer never had. Historical parallels, a modern Galileo. To many observers, Oppenheimer's fall echoed that of Galileo, another brilliant mind punished not for heresy, but for refusing to recant his truth. He was not accused of treason, but of doubt, conscience, and caution. And in the climate of Cold War America, these were unforgivable sins. The legacy of the hearing. The 1954 hearing did not erase Oppenheimer from history, but it redefined him. He would no longer be seen as the triumphant figure of Trinity, but as a tragic and morally troubled prophet, a man who had seen too much, known too much, and questioned too much. His downfall served as a warning to others. Even the brightest minds could be crushed by the machinery of politics. Yet to later generations, it also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear-driven governance and the importance of dissent in a democratic society. Conclusion. A martyr to conscience. Robert Oppenheimer once said, "There are no secrets about the world of nature. There are secrets about the thoughts and intentions of men." The security hearing revealed both the nature of science and the darker nature of politics. Oppenheimer had given the world the atomic bomb. In return, it gave him suspicion, exile, and regret. But his legacy, though wounded, endured. He remained, in the words of philosopher Isaiah Berlin, one of the most tragic and gifted figures of our age. Chapter 7, Final Years. Illness, Reflection, and a Late Vindication. Retreat to Princeton. After his public disgrace in 1954, J. Robert Oppenheimer withdrew from the political spotlight. He returned to his position as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a role he had held since 1947. Though the institute was a sanctuary of intellectual inquiry, his world had shrunk dramatically. He no longer advised the government. He was no longer welcome in the halls of military power. And yet, at Princeton, he found a kind of quiet dignity among peers who still respected his intellect. The institute became his cloister, a space where he could think, read, and teach, but not forget. A man of contradictions? Oppenheimer's personality in these years became even more complex. Colleagues described him as witty and sophisticated in conversation, quoting French poets or Sanskrit texts with ease, melancholic and distant, especially after long periods of introspection, warm with some students, yet aloof with others, especially those who reminded him of his past. He remained a chain smoker, often cloaked in his signature trench coat. He would sometimes walk Princeton's wooded trails for hours, alone, in silence. Other times, he could be found laughing with visitors over a bottle of wine. But those who knew him best saw the wounds beneath the surface. He carried a deep sadness, a sense of betrayal, and the weight of a world he had helped change, perhaps for the worse. Family and strain. His marriage to Kitty Oppenheimer deteriorated further in these years. Kitty, never stable emotionally, grew increasingly dependent on alcohol. The couple drifted apart emotionally, though they never separated. Their children, Peter and Catherine, were impacted by the chaos and silence in the household. Oppenheimer tried to engage as a father, but his tendency toward emotional distance and self-absorption made it difficult. Despite these challenges, he remained devoted to family in his own way, concerned for their futures, anxious about his legacy, but often unsure how to express his feelings. Intellectual renaissance. Although politically sidelined, Oppenheimer continued to write, lecture, and travel. He gave talks at universities across the world and participated in philosophical debates on the role of science in society. He delivered a famous series of lectures at MIT, later compiled as Science and the Common Understanding, where he warned of the dangers of technological advancement without moral restraint. He also participated in international conferences on peace, arms control, and nuclear proliferation. Though he was no longer in the government's inner circle, many abroad viewed him as a prophet of the atomic age, a man who had seen the power of destruction and now called for restraint. His deep love for literature and philosophy blossomed in this period. He reread Proust, Dostoevsky, and the Bhagavad Gita, and even began writing essays on ethics, history, and the burden of knowledge. An illness emerges. In 1965, Oppenheimer began experiencing severe throat pain and persistent hoarseness. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, likely exacerbated by decades of heavy smoking. Despite surgery, and radiation treatments, the cancer had spread. He became increasingly gaunt, his voice weak, and his energy diminished. Friends who visited him in these years described a man still sharp in mind, but frail in body. Yet even as he battled illness, Oppenheimer continued to read voraciously, receive students, and host small gatherings at his Princeton home. He remained intellectually curious until the end. A quiet vindication. In a surprising turn of events, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award in 1963, a prestigious honor for scientific achievement. The gesture was widely seen as a symbolic rehabilitation of his public image. The award was presented by AEC Chairman Glenn Seaborg, a nuclear chemist who had once supported the hydrogen bomb that Oppenheimer opposed. The moment was bittersweet. In his brief remarks, Oppenheimer said, "In the history of science, the greatest reward is the simple discovery of truth. I am grateful for the honor you have given me." It was not an apology. It was not revenge. It was, perhaps, closure. The final days, as 1966 gave way to 1967, Oppenheimer's health rapidly declined. He was bedridden for weeks, surrounded by books, memories, and the quiet hum of Princeton's winter wind. He refused pity. He welcomed only a few visitors. One of them, a young physicist, later wrote, "He looked like a man already half in another world, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of civilizations." On the 18th of February, 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer died at the age of 62. His ashes were scattered into the sea near St. John in the Virgin Islands, one of his favorite places. Legacy of a complicated genius. In the years following his death, Oppenheimer's legacy has been fiercely debated. To some, he remains the father of the atomic bomb, a symbol of brilliance and ambition. To others, he is a cautionary tale, a man destroyed by the very forces he helped unleash. To many scientists, he is a tragic Prometheus, punished not for his sins, but for his conscience. His story is told in biographies, documentaries, plays, and most recently, in blockbuster films. He is remembered not just as a physicist, but as a philosopher of science, someone who questioned the moral implications of discovery, a man of many selves. To truly understand Oppenheimer is to embrace contradiction. The charismatic leader and the haunted recluse, the brilliant theorist and the naive political player, the warrior for science and the advocate for peace, the lover of poetry who built a weapon that turned cities to ash. He once told a student, "It is not possible to be both the architect of destruction and the guardian of hope, yet I have tried." Perhaps no better words could define the paradox of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Conclusion. The price of knowledge. Robert Oppenheimer changed the world not just with a bomb, but with a question. What is the responsibility of a scientist? It is a question we still struggle with today, in the age of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and climate change. His life offers no simple answers, only the reminder that genius is not free from guilt and that progress without conscience can lead to tragedy. As the radioactive glow of the 20th century fades into history, Oppenheimer's silhouette remains on the desert plains of Trinity, in the halls of Princeton, and in the minds of all who dare to explore the double-edged sword of knowledge. Chapter 8. Oppenheimer in Popular Culture, Philosophy, and Modern Debate. The Resurrection of a Mythic Figure. After his death in 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer transcended the realm of science and entered the domain of myth. Over the decades, he evolved into a complex cultural symbol, a tragic genius, scientific prophet, and moral martyr of the atomic age. Few scientists have so thoroughly captured the public imagination. His legacy has been re-examined through films and plays, biographies and documentaries, political discourse, philosophical and ethical analysis. Each portrayal reflects a society struggling with the same dilemmas Oppenheimer faced: the cost of progress, the burden of knowledge, and the role of conscience in science. In literature and theater, theatrical portrayals were among the first to explore Oppenheimer's emotional and moral conflict. In The Matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer, 1964, a dramatic recreation of his security hearing presented his story as a courtroom tragedy. Einar Kiphart's play, adapted for television and stage, portrayed him as a Galileo-like figure, questioned not for wrongdoing but for independent thinking. In Tom Morton, Smith's Oppenheimer, 2015 Royal Shakespeare Company, the audience witnesses his transformation from brilliant scientist to haunted visionary. These works often center on the inner turmoil of Oppenheimer, contrasting his brilliance with his regret, and setting him as a modern Prometheus punished for giving mankind forbidden fire. Hollywood's fascination. Hollywood eventually embraced Oppenheimer's story as a cautionary epic. In the 2023 film Oppenheimer, directed by Christopher Nolan and starring Cillian Murphy, his character was portrayed not only as a physicist, but as a deeply troubled man tormented by the bomb's legacy. The film captured his intellectual charisma, the pressures of Trinity and Los Alamos, the emotional and moral collapse following Hiroshima, the public humiliation of the 1,954 hearing. Nolan's cinematic portrayal reignited global interest in Oppenheimer's life and raised modern parallels to today's scientific dilemmas: artificial intelligence, climate engineering, and biogenetics. In biographies and documentaries, the definitive biography remains American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006. The book paints a comprehensive picture: a brilliant student alienated from childhood peers, a seductive intellectual with complex romantic entanglements, a leader struggling with moral consequence, a man persecuted for political thought, not criminal action. Other documentaries, including those by PBS, BBC, and the History Channel, have illuminated lesser-known aspects such as his love of poetry, his philosophical grounding in Hinduism, and his shifting views on national security. The Bhagavad Gita and the Atomic Soul. One of the most iconic moments of Oppenheimer's life remains his quoting of the Bhagavad Gita upon witnessing the Trinity test. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This quote encapsulates his transformation from physicist to moral philosopher. His interest in the Gita and Sanskrit philosophy was more than intellectual. It reflected his deeper struggle with power, fate, and morality. To many, this single line has come to represent the moral awakening of modern science. The Gita, like Oppenheimer, walks a line between duty and destruction, enlightenment and tragedy. A philosophical legacy. Oppenheimer's moral legacy lives on in debates within science ethics, nuclear non-proliferation, military technology, artificial intelligence. He is often cited in classrooms and international panels as a figure who warned society against blind pursuit of technological advancement without ethical guardrails. In lectures, he would say, "In some sort of crude sense, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." This idea of scientific sin, the burden of unintended consequences, has become central to discussions about AI, genome editing, cybersecurity, and climate intervention. In policy and international debate, Oppenheimer's fate is often referenced in political discussions about the role of dissent in national security, the criminalization of ideology, the balance between loyalty and liberty. The 1,954 hearing is now widely regarded as a McCarthy-era miscarriage of justice, emblematic of how fear and ideology can crush reasoned dialogue. His posthumous rehabilitation by the scientific community and the government reflects a growing realization that skepticism is not treason, and that complex figures should not be reduced to caricatures. Symbolism in science and society. Today, Oppenheimer symbolizes many things, depending on the lens. In academia, the perils of knowledge unbound by ethics. In government, the danger of silencing dissent. In culture, the archetype of the haunted genius. In philosophy, the embodiment of moral ambiguity. He is invoked in speeches about emerging technologies, in academic discussions about scientific responsibility, and in novels and films exploring the human cost of innovation, modern reinterpretations, and relevance. In the 21st century, Oppenheimer has gained new relevance. As AI scientists, climate engineers, and biotech innovators face the possibility of irreversible global impact, the question returns: what would Oppenheimer have done? His complex personality, torn between duty and doubt, brilliance and breakdown, resonates deeply in our current age, where power often precedes prudence. Some view him as a tragic warning, others as a visionary figure ahead of his time. What remains constant is the depth of his humanity, his awareness of consequence, his embrace of doubt, his struggle with guilt. Legacy in education and ethics? Oppenheimer is now taught in high school history and ethics classes, university philosophy and political science courses, science and technology ethics seminars. His life is used to prompt questions such as: should scientists be responsible for how their discoveries are used? Can patriotism coexist with political dissent? What happens when brilliance is met with betrayal? His story encourages students to reflect on the intersection of knowledge and power, and to realize that science is never morally neutral. Conclusion: more than a man. J. Robert Oppenheimer is no longer just a man. He is a paradox, a symbol, a mirror held up to the modern world. His legacy lives in every ethical debate over powerful technologies, in every protest against militarized science, and in every scientist who dares to ask, should we do this just because we can? He lived and died with contradictions he could never fully resolve. But perhaps that's what makes him eternal. Chapter 9. Letters, Interviews, and First-Person Reflections. Oppenheimer in his own words. A voice beyond equations. While J. Robert Oppenheimer was revered for his mastery of physics, he was equally admired and feared for the precision of his words. His letters, speeches, and interviews reveal not just the mind of a scientist, but the soul of a man grappling with immense power and consequence. Throughout his life, Oppenheimer wrote and spoke with piercing clarity. His reflections on science, war, ethics, and love offer a direct channel into his inner world. Correspondence with fellow scientists. Oppenheimer's letters to colleagues like Niels Bohr, Isidore Rabi, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller reveal a man always balancing admiration with intellectual challenge. In one 1943 letter to Bohr, shortly after the Danish physicist visited Los Alamos, "We are not just building a weapon, we are constructing a threshold. What lies beyond it I do not yet see, but I feel it presses against us like a silent tide." His letters often shift from technical discussions of neutron diffusion or isotope separation to moral metaphors and poetic phrasing. These dualities define him. In 1944, writing to Ernest Lawrence, "It is not the weapon that terrifies me, but the momentum of its making. I worry that we are building not an answer, but a question too large to answer." Love and complexity in private letters. Oppenheimer's personal letters to women in his life, especially Jean Tatlock and his wife Kitty, reflect a deeply emotional, often conflicted man. To Jean Tatlock, shortly before her suicide in 1944, he wrote, "You are the mirror I fear and the solace I crave. The physics is never what troubles me, it is the silence between human souls." With Kitty, Their correspondence was often marked by irony, coldness, and flashes of passion. One letter during the Manhattan Project read, "I have built something terrible, not just in the desert, but in myself. I hope you'll forgive the absences, the edges, the broken pieces of what I bring home." His romantic entanglements, intellectualized and tragic, show the side of a man more intimate with paradox than peace. Public interviews, science, war, and morality. In a 1955 BBC interview, Oppenheimer was asked whether he had any regrets. "I carry no guilt in the theological sense, but I know fully that what we made changed the world, and not entirely for the better." He then paused, exhaled, and said, "We had to build it. It was the time, but we should have governed it better." In a 1960 interview with Newsweek, the sin was not the bomb itself. The sin was in the failure to make the peace. These public moments reveal his resigned wisdom, a man neither justifying nor condemning, but dissecting his own legacy with surgical honesty. Testimony at the security hearing. Perhaps his most revealing words came during the 1954 Atomic Energy Commission hearing, where his clearance was revoked. Under intense scrutiny, he said, "When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it. That's what we did. We made the bomb. But then some of us thought perhaps we should pause." Pressed further about why he had opposed the hydrogen bomb, he said, "It wasn't that I didn't think it could be done. I knew it could. I simply believed strongly that we were already past the point of reason." To many, these statements weren't just defenses. They were confessions, spoken in a tone of sorrow, not defiance. Lectures and ethical reflections. In his 1953 lecture, Prospects in the Arts and Sciences, Oppenheimer warned, "In science there are no rewards for wisdom. There are only results. But we must somehow breed a scientific culture that does not divorce fact from foresight." He concluded, "If we cannot align progress with purpose, we will invent our own demise." Another quote from a 1959 lecture at Princeton, "No man should live with power he does not understand. And yet all modern men do." These haunting reflections shaped generations of thinkers, ethicists, and scientists who looked to Oppenheimer not as a savior or villain, but a man of warning. Poetic inclinations. His early love of poetry remained with him until death. He often quoted T.S. Eliot, Baudelaire, and the Bhagavad Gita in interviews and writings. In a note found in one of his Princeton notebooks, he wrote, "I am a bundle of fears wrapped in equations, a prayer disguised as a theory." In another scribbled entry, he paraphrased Gita again. "He who sees inaction in action and action in inaction is wise among men." His literary mind shaped not just how he thought, but how he communicated the magnitude of what he created. Final interviews and last reflections. In one of his final interviews in 1966, just before his illness overwhelmed him, Oppenheimer reflected on legacy. "I suppose I will be remembered for the bomb, but I'd rather be remembered for having asked loudly and early what comes after." When asked if he still believed in humanity, he said, "Yes, but I believe we are children with fire, and the fire is growing." These were not the words of a man at peace, but of one who understood that peace was perhaps never his to find. The written ghost. Oppenheimer's papers, notes, and reflections are now stored in archives across the U.S., from the Library of Congress to Harvard University. Scholars pore over them to understand not just history, but the moral anatomy of modern science. In a 1947 notebook entry after Hiroshima, he wrote, "Our inheritance is not just destruction, but the capacity to feel it." That single sentence is now engraved at a memorial exhibit in Los Alamos. Conclusion: the mind that spoke like a poet. J. Robert Oppenheimer's reflections spanning love, science, war, and remorse form a literary map of the 20th century's conscience. He was not a politician, yet he shaped policy. He was not a priest, yet he spoke of sin. He was not a poet, yet his words will be quoted for generations. Through his letters and interviews, we glimpse not just a scientist, but a man trying desperately to make peace with the knowledge he unleashed. Chapter 10, Posthumous Legacy: Oppenheimer's Enduring Influence in Science, Policy, and Culture. A death that sparked reflection. J. Robert Oppenheimer died on the 18th of February, 1967, in Princeton, New Jersey, of throat cancer. He was 62 years old. But in many ways, his cultural and historical life had just begun. His death prompted a global re-examination of his contributions, remorse, and the haunting weight of his choices. No longer shackled by the political controversies that hounded his later years, historians, scientists, politicians, and artists began to reconstruct his legacy, one far more nuanced than the label of Father of the Atomic Bomb. Scientific contributions and reverberations. Even apart from the bomb, Oppenheimer's early work in theoretical physics contributed to our understanding of quantum electrodynamics, neutron stars and black holes, long before the term black hole was coined, cosmic ray showers, relativistic quantum mechanics. His doctoral students, many of whom became Nobel laureates, extended his influence through the physics world. Some called his Princeton lectures life-changing in their clarity and depth. In retrospect, Oppenheimer was not merely a scientific project manager, he was a catalyst for an entire generation of scientific achievement, a pedagogical legacy. Oppenheimer's years as a professor at Caltech and UC Berkeley, and later at the Institute for Advanced Study, left a permanent imprint on academic culture. His legacy in education lives on in the interdisciplinary ethos he promoted, the emphasis on ethical responsibility in research, a culture of critical inquiry and humanistic integration in science. Many modern-day courses in science ethics reference Oppenheimer as a case study in both genius and responsibility. His story is often taught alongside those of Galileo, Einstein, and Rachel Carson, people who transformed the world while grappling with its consequences. Rehabilitation and recognition. In the decades after his death, both the U.S. government and the scientific community gradually moved to reclaim and honor Oppenheimer's legacy. In 1994, the Department of Energy released a review calling the 1,954 hearing fundamentally flawed. In 2022, the Biden administration formally vacated the revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance, declaring that the process had violated the standards of due process and fairness. This posthumous rehabilitation was not just symbolic, it was a public acknowledgement that fear and politics had silenced one of the country's greatest minds, during a time it needed thoughtful dissent the most. Influence on modern policy debates. Oppenheimer's fate has become a touchstone in discussions of whistleblower protections, government overreach, science and national security, the ethics of weapons development. He is frequently invoked in congressional debates and policy forums where experts question, are we repeating the sins of Oppenheimer's era? In debates about AI weapons, gene editing, and cyber warfare, scholars point back to Oppenheimer's experience to emphasize the importance of transparency, civilian oversight, and moral foresight in science. The moral martyr of the atomic age. Public discourse increasingly casts Oppenheimer as a moral martyr, not because he was perfect, but because he publicly agonized over what others pursued without hesitation. He is compared to figures like Socrates for his defiant self-inquiry, Prometheus for delivering fire and enduring punishment, Faust for trading knowledge for terrible power. This mythic status endures because the dilemmas he faced remain unsolved. In modern film and media, the 2023 Christopher Nolan film Oppenheimer brought his story to a new global audience, many of whom had never heard of him. The film grossed over $900 million worldwide. It sparked public dialogue about scientific ethics and national responsibility. It led to new interest in physics, Cold War history, and Hindu philosophy. More importantly, it humanized Oppenheimer, showing not just the creation of the bomb, but the unraveling of a conscience. His legacy in the nuclear world. Today's nuclear policy community views Oppenheimer with reverence and caution. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, global arms reduction treaties, and the global conversation around disarmament owe part of their ethical foundation to his post-war advocacy. Even his failures, like his inability to prevent the hydrogen bomb, are instructive. They reveal the fragility of influence when science meets politics. A symbol for the conscientious scientist, modern scientists often cite Oppenheimer as an example of the burden of innovation. In biosciences, artificial intelligence, and planetary engineering, the Oppenheimer question lingers. If you create something powerful, are you responsible for what happens next? His story underscores the unavoidable collision between knowledge and power and the need for scientists to have a voice in how their work is applied. Oppenheimer and global education. Across the world, his story is now part of advanced placement history curriculums, university ethics modules, documentaries translated into dozens of languages, public exhibits and traveling science museums, institutions like the Smithsonian, CERN, and United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, have hosted symposia and exhibitions focusing on his life and legacy. His face on the wall. Today, portraits of Oppenheimer hang in halls of science not just as tributes, but as reminders. Reminders that vision without conscience is dangerous. Silence in the face of policy is complicity. Great intellect carries a price. Many young physicists report that learning about Oppenheimer changed how they view their field. It encourages them to think not only in terms of discovery, but of consequence. Legacy in the arts and humanities. Oppenheimer's story has been embraced by artists, poets, playwrights, and philosophers. He is quoted in rap lyrics, painted into modern murals, and invoked in protest art. Academic journals analyze his moral struggle alongside Shakespearean figures. His quote from the Bhagavad Gita has become iconic, almost scriptural, in discussions of technology's double edge. Where once he was exiled, now he is embraced as a voice who asked the questions most were afraid to ask. The greatest measure of Oppenheimer's legacy is not in uranium or blueprints, but in the moral discourse that follows him. He is the scientist who asked, "What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Can we live with the answers?" These questions echo into the future, growing louder as our tools grow more powerful. Robert Oppenheimer did not just leave behind a scientific legacy, he left a moral landscape. One in which every discovery must walk side by side with ethics, accountability, and humility. His story remains both a warning and a compass, a reminder that brilliance without introspection is not genius, but risk. His name lives on in textbooks, museums, think tanks, and cinema. But more than that, it lives in the questions we now ask when we invent something new. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of all. Chapter 11, Timeline of Major Events, Chronology of Works, and Closing Thoughts. Section 1, Timeline of Major Events in Oppenheimer's Life. Year 1904. Born on April 20, 2-inch, New York City. 1922-1925. Studied at Harvard University, majoring in chemistry and physics. Graduated summa cum laude. 1926-1927. Studied under Max Born at the University of Göttingen, Germany. Worked alongside Wolfgang Pauli and Werner Heisenberg. 1927-1929. Traveled across Europe. Postdoctoral studies at Leiden and Zurich. Met key physicists including Paul Dirac. 1929. Returned to the U.S. Began teaching at Caltech and UC Berkeley. 1932nd. Made early theoretical contributions to quantum electrodynamics and cosmic ray research. 1939. Reacted to the discovery of nuclear fission in Germany with deep concern. Began promoting nuclear research in the U.S. 1942. Appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. 1945. Oversaw Trinity test, the 16th of July. Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. 1945-1946. Advocated against further nuclear proliferation. Met with Truman and was reportedly dismissed emotionally. 1954. Security clearance revoked after controversial AEC hearing. Publicly humiliated and marginalized from U.S. nuclear policy. 1955-1966. Continued writing, lecturing, and directing the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. 1963. Awarded the Enrico Fermi Award by President Lyndon B. Johnson, partial public rehabilitation. 1967. Died of throat cancer on February 18-inch Princeton, New Jersey. Section 2. Key scientific contributions. 1. Quantum mechanics. Formulated what is now known as the Oppenheimer-Phillips process, explaining certain nuclear reactions. Conducted important work on quantum tunneling and relativistic quantum field theory. 2. Black holes and neutron stars. In 1939, co-authored a paper describing gravitational collapse, a precursor to the concept of black holes. One of the first scientists to speculate about stellar remnants exceeding the Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit. 3. Cosmic ray research. Pioneered understanding of high-energy particles in Earth's atmosphere. Investigated how cosmic rays interact with atomic nuclei, early steps in astroparticle physics. 4. Theoretical physics education. Mentored dozens of the 20th century's leading physicists. Advocated for a holistic, philosophical approach to science, integrating the humanities. Section 3. Major published works. 1954. Explored the interface of science and public policy. 1955. Lectures on ethics, science, and freedom of thought. 1958. A meditation on the place of the scientist in modern society. 1964. Discussed 3 moral dilemmas faced by physicists in the atomic age. Numerous letters, lectures, and essays now archived at Library of Congress, Harvard, and Princeton. Section 4. Tributes, Honors, and Posthumous Recognition. Enrico Fermi Award, 1963. For contributions to theoretical physics and leadership in science. Doe clearance vacated, 2022. U.S. government acknowledged procedural injustice in 1954 hearing. Numerous academic chairs and centers named after him in universities across the world. Film Oppenheimer, 2023, reignited international interest in his life and legacy. Section 5. Enduring Ethical Legacy. Oppenheimer's name has become synonymous with the burden of discovery, the intersection of morality and science, the tragedy of intellectual exile. He is cited in modern debates on artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cyber warfare, environmental science. He is a case study in nearly every university ethics course involving science and policy. J. Robert Oppenheimer's life was not simply the story of a man who built the bomb. It was the story of a man who opened a door for humanity that could never be shut, fought to slow the rushing tide he helped unleash, lived with a paradox. His greatest success became his deepest sorrow. He was called a genius, a traiteur, a prophet, a ghost of the Cold War. But above all, he was a mirror showing us what happens when intelligence outpaces wisdom, when ambition ignores consequence, and when men touch powers once thought divine. In the end, I suppose I will be remembered for the bomb, but I hope someone, somewhere, will also remember the silence after it exploded and the questions that silence left behind. Robert Oppenheimer, 1961